mute myself. Oops.
Stay comfortable.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, where we get engaged with the Torah text in a more fundamental way, in a more adult way, and we ask the big questions, the questions that need to be asked to enable us to really find some deeper meaning in the topics at hand. This week really requires a certain level of bracketing before we start. Bracketing means just putting some sort of boundaries in place about the subject matter. Why? Well, actually, the amazing thing about this week is that the particular content that I'm sharing with you, I already learned a number of years ago. It's something which speaks profoundly to me. And nevertheless, I think current events have made the topics that we're dealing with tonight particularly pertinent. So what I'm trying to say is the following. There's a certain topic, there's a certain idea that we're going to share this week about rebellion, about privilege, about equality, about difference. And that is something that the Torah has been talking about for thousands of years. It just happens to be that right now we're in the middle of a situation globally where that is on everyone's mouth. So that is what we're all thinking about when we log into the news and we see riots, and we see, if anyone's kind of watched that very distressing footage of George Floyd dying, being killed. If anyone has been watching the riots and the anger on both sides, and just the incredible sense of voice and voicelessness, and almost a question about right to voice, the ability to have a voice. Who would listen? Who should listen? There's so much going on at the moment. It's on everyone's minds. So this is a shir that was not intended to talk about today, but it talks about today. So I'm going to try, and I think it's always dangerous when we, as a rabbi, we position things in a political way, because I don't think that's necessarily the point. I think what I'd like us to learn the ideas together. I'm going to dip into some of the terminology of the moment, because I think that heightens things, and it's important, I think, to be activated by the material. But I'm not trying to pass judgment on anything that has happened or is happening. I'm not trying to start to put myself in a particular camp or a particular way of seeing things. I'm really just seeking to understand what is going on from the text, and what the text tells us about certain ways of human being that we learn out from Am Yisrael, that we learn out from the people of Israel, but could be applied right today, this very moment. So it's more about the seeking to understand and kind of just think about what's going on. It's not attempting to draw direct parallels, but parallels are there. So that's sort of bracketing here. I'm not making a social commentary. We're learning Torah together. Happens to be when you learn Torah, Torah talks to real life. And there's nothing quite like when real life and Torah intersect so powerfully as they will today. Okay. This week's Torah portion is Parshas Korach. And it tells, for most of the narrative, the dramatic story of how Korach, who is one of the elite in the Jewish people, leads a rebellion against Moses. It's a dramatic rebellion, and it has a very, very sad end, because Korach and his entire followers, they literally, the whole rebellion implodes, or rather the ground opens up and swallows Korach and his followers. So this rebellion doesn't end well. But it's a very interesting argument that Korach launches against the leadership of the day. Let's call it the elite of the day. And he launches this argument, and we need to understand what the argument was, what Moses' response was, and where really Korach fell foul of his own motivation. But before we start to get involved with the particular story, there's one question that I think jumps out from the scenario, from the from the story itself. It's an external question. That means it's not a question about particular words in the text. It's a question that arises from the text. And it's a question that we probably often don't think about because it almost just passes us by. And so the question that we have to ask is, what is going on at this stage in the story of Am Yisrael, in the story of the Jewish people, that right now, there's a rebellion? Why is it this point, this juncture, this moment in their journey that there is a rebellion? Because Moses and Aaron have been running the show for a little while already. And up until this point, there hasn't been out and out rejection of their leadership. There's been questions of going back to Egypt, wondering about maybe it would be more appropriate. Maybe it would be, we'd be better off dying there than over here. But no actual out and out rejection of the leadership of Moses and Aaron. So we have to try and work out what is it that is happening right now. And in order to do that, let's just begin by looking at the word of our protagonist, the name of our protagonist, the name Korach. It's an amazing thing that actually there are only a very select handful of Torah portions which are named after an individual. There's Yitro, after Moses' father-in-law. There's Balak, after the king that decided to try and curse the Jewish people. And then there's Korach. So I'm opening up, this is now more of an internal question, a word question. Does anyone know what the word Korach has as at its root? What does korcha, the word in Hebrew, what does that mean? Don't mind a bit of Google Translate if you want. Anyone? So you'll be surprised. Korach means baldy, someone who has no hair. Korach means baldy. Korach was the bald one. Okay, that's what his name meant. He was a baldy. Now, that's an interesting thing in itself, to be called baldy. Some people, I always have this conversation with people about hairlines, because when you put on tefillin, so the law is that the head tefillin have to be behind where your hairline ends. So the head tefillin have to be behind this point. They can't be over the hairline, right? So you can't have these tefillin sort of sticking out your forehead. And then there's always the conversation with that particular dad and all where your hairline used to be, right? So for those who might be hairline challenged, it's where their hairline used to be. Now, why is Korach called baldy? And maybe we could extend the question slightly differently. Does anyone know of anywhere else in the Torah that talks about baldness, that talks about hairlessness or causing baldness?
Sorry, I was thinking in Tanakh, there's an episode in one of the prophets where someone's called Baldy in a wood or something, isn't there? He gets attacked and he's called Oi Baldy.
Right.
That's a different episode.
Yeah, that is slightly different. Simon's taking offense for the baldness. I thought the reason that you thought maybe I'd be a good rabbi is just to compensate for. Anyway, but no. So that's going to be maybe somewhere else in Tanakh about being called the bald one, and there is something to be learned from there. But there's a case, there's a law in the Torah which talks about baldness, and I'll share that with you. Do our first screen share of the evening. Here we are. Okay, so it says over here, Banim, this is now in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, and the verse says, Banim atem lahashem Elokeichem, you are children of the Lord your God. Lo yisis godedu, you shall not cut yourselves, and should not make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. So this is now in Deuteronomy. It's in the next book of the Torah, and it's referring to certain practices of the Amorites when they were mourning for their dead, that they would do a little bit of self-harm. They would cut themselves in pain for the grief that they felt when someone had passed. And they would also pull out often this patch of hair just at the front of their head. They would pull out patches of hair in pain. They would create baldness. And that word korcha, if you can see over here, velota simu korcha, that means that's the same word as korach. Velota simu korcha. Don't make a bald spot. Don't make a korach bein einechem lames, between your eyes for someone who's passed. Ki am kadesh ata, because you are a holy nation, la Hashem Elokecha, Lord your God, ubecha bachar Hashem, and God has chosen you. Lios lo am segula, to be to him a treasured nation. Mikol ha'amim, out of all the nations, al sher al pnei ha'adamah, who is on the face of the earth. Okay, so we are now, we just see that the word baldness is appearing here. Now, I don't necessarily have to say that this has any connection to the story of Korach. But I want us now, just to, for the sake of reviewing the text of Korach, but also for seeing any other similarities, want us to just to read through the English of the Korach story a little bit. It will help us to familiarize ourselves with the story, but also I want you to listen out. Are there any other similarities between the bald story, the bald situation, the command not to self-harm or pull out hair, and the story of Korach? So here we go. So this is our parasha. Korach, the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kohas, the Kahas, the son of Levi. So he's the great grandson of Levi. He's big stuff. So took himself. He's Moshe's cousin by that fact. He's a cousin of Moshe, because Moshe is also a great grandson, I think, of Levi. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, so along with Datan and Aviram, he took with himself Datan and Aviram, another two people who were leaders, the sons of Eliav and On, the son of Pelet, descendants of Reuven. So they've got further other bigwigs together. They confronted Moshe together with 250 men from the children of Israel, chieftains of the congregation. So we've got a lot of significant people here, representatives of the assembly, men of repute. So they're all coming here and they are beginning this this rebellion against Moshe. They assembled against Moshe and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for the entire congregation are all holy. You are taking too much privilege onto yourselves, Moshe and Aaron. Why are you doing that? All of us, we're all holy. All our lives matter. We are all equal. And the Lord is in their midst. We're all holy and the Lord's in our midst. So we see that Hashem relates to us all similarly. Why do you raise yourselves above the Lord's people? What sort of privilege, what sort of merit, what sort of elitism are you holding?" Moshe heard and fell on his face. He spoke to Korach and to all his company, saying, "In the morning, Hashem is going to make known who is his and who is holy, and he will draw near to them. And the one he chooses, he will draw near to them." So Moshe is now almost asserting difference, or asserting a need for difference. You want to make us all the same? Says Moshe. Well, let's just see what Hashem does. He's not agreeing almost to this idea that everyone is the same. He's saying that there can be difference here and that Hashem is going to assert difference. "Do this, Korach and his company, take yourselves incense censers, take yourself incense pans, place fire into them and put incense upon them before the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom Hashem chooses, he's the Holy One. So then you've taken too much upon yourselves, sons of Levi." So he's saying that Hashem is going to choose through incense testing. If Hashem chooses the particular incense pan, that will be a demonstration of which one Hashem wants to lead the people. We'll talk more about how this response makes sense in a little bit later on in our session together. So place fire, so we said that right. Verse 8, Moshe said to Korach, "Please listen, sons of Levi. Is it not enough that Hashem has distinguished you from the congregation of Israel? Is it not enough that you as Levites are different? You're already different." Okay, by the way, so we'll just notice this now. Korach's explicit message was, there's no difference between any of us. And Moshe now says, is it not enough that you're a bit different, that you're a Levite? It's almost like they're not speaking the same language, it seems, at first glance. Korach's saying we're all the same, and Moshe says, isn't it enough that you're a bit different? Okay, so please listen, sons of Levi. Is it not enough that the God of Israel has distinguished you from the congregation of Israel to draw you near to him? Your special Levites to perform the service in the tabernacle, in the Mishkan of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them. Is it not enough that you already have an exalted job amongst all the other Jews? He drew you near, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you. And now you seek the kahuna as well. Now you seek the priesthood. It's not enough that you're a Levi. Now you want to be like Aaron. Now you want to be a priest too. Okay. Therefore, you and your entire company who are assembled are against the Lord. Are against the Lord. For what is Aaron that you should complain against him? Why are you complaining against Aaron? It's not against Aaron you've got a complaint. It's against God. Remember, God is the one who invested Aaron as the priest. It wasn't Aaron who invested himself as the priest. Moshe sent to call Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliav, but they said, we'll not go up. So now Moshe tries to reason with the other leaders. So he realizes he's not going to get anywhere with Korach, but let's at least speak to Datan and Aviram. Let's at least speak to the other ones. And they point blank refuse to even talk to him. They don't even go up to him. They don't even come to have a conversation. And they say, is it not enough that you brought us out of a land flowing, by the way, kudos to Adolf Bieter again for the content, flowing in milk and honey to kill us in the desert. You should also exercise authority over us. Is it not enough that you took us out? You tried to, you didn't allow us to have that promise of milk and honey. You're going to kill us in the desert, and now you also want to lord it over us? You've not even brought us to that land. You haven't taken us to the promised home, to that land flowing with milk and honey. Nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Even if you gouge out the eyes of those men, we will not go up. Okay, so that's the story so far. That's the story of this rebellion. But what we're trying to see at the moment is if Baldy has any similarities in text to the arguments, right? Any similarities in text between these Amorite practices in Deuteronomy and the arguments that Korach, that Baldy is making over here. So this is intertextuality. This is an internal analysis of the text. Is there anything about what we're being told here about why we shouldn't make a bald patch on our heads to any of the arguments that Korach makes? Anyone? I'm going to give you a clue. If you look at verse 3, you might find something. Verse 3 in the story of Korach. So let's do this together. Over here in the Amorite practices, it says, don't make a bald spot, but then it provides a rationale why not to make a bald spot. Why? Ki am kadosh ata, you're a holy nation. What's the argument that Korach makes? What's the argument that Korach makes as to why everyone's the same? For the entire congregation are all holy, right? He says, Ki kol ha'ida kulam kadoshim, all of us are holy. That's the argument he makes. And now he makes for why the rebellion should go ahead is because we're all holy. That's one similarity. Another similarity over here, Uvacha b'char Hashem. The reason that we are told that we should not, the reason that we're told that we should not do these Amorite practices of mourning is because we are a treasured nation. We are selected out from amongst the other nations. By the way, that already raises interesting issues or questions about privilege, having this idea of being the chosen people, but we'll park that for a minute. But there's a certain idea of chosenness over here, that we are all a chosen nation. And over here again, we're seeing that there is this sense that there's a chosenness that Korach is referring to. The entire congregation is holy. The Hashem is within us. Hashem is within us. So if you want to look at the maybe a better visual of that comparison, we get it over here. So we see that Over here is the case. Over here on the right hand side is the Amorite practices, and over here on the left hand side is the Korach's argument. And sorry, the third. So the first. I'm sorry, I've lost my words. The first comparison is Korach. The word Korach is baldy, is don't make a bald spot. The second comparison is that Korach says all the congregation, they're all holy. And the reason that we can't make a bald spot is because we're a holy nation. And the third comparison is why do you raise yourselves up above why do you raise yourselves up, Moses and Aaron, above the rest of us? Why are you asserting your own elitism, your own privilege above the rest of us? And that idea of being above others, of being chosen, of being kind of selected up, is also the rationale as to why we shouldn't do this Amorite practice of mourning. So a few are elevated above the rest. So first one, baldness. Second one, children of Israel all holy. Third similarity, a few are elevated above the many. So there's some sort of message that is being told over here. And that message seems to be that if we're going to understand the Korach story, we have to understand its similarity to mourning. What could that be? And the answer is that if we're going to look at mourning, what happens when we're mourning? We're grieving. And maybe the context which we now need to seek out and consider when it comes to the Korach story is, are the people grieving? What could they be grieving about? What are they mourning? There's a comparison, right? That the verses seem to link us to mourning, to a situation of mourning in Deuteronomy. What are they mourning about over here at this juncture? It's the question that we began with at the beginning of the session, which is, why now? Why now?
So, the spies? We just got over the spies.
Yeah, so what happened at the spies, Dan?
It wasn't great.
It wasn't great. And so
they didn't give a great report.
Pardon?
And they didn't give a great report, and they'd ultimately found out this generation was going to die out and not actually see Israel anyway.
Right. So they're mourning their lost dream. They're mourning the option that they had, the ability they had. They thought they're going to go into the land of Israel. They thought they're going to go to this land of milk and honey.
You can actually argue it slightly differently.
Go on.
What they're mourning is the fact that they are being forced to pass from being in the desert, where it's a spiritual idyll, into a land that will subsume them and anchor them into the material world. And actually, they're not mourning the loss that they think they're not going to get to Eretz Israel, but they're mourning what's actually going to happen when they do get there, which is what they're leaving behind, which is this far more spiritual existence.
Right. So they were wrapped up in these clouds of glory. They had this beautiful time. The thing is, you're right, that actually we see such a thing later on when the next generation are about to go in. There's almost a hesitance to leave the desert. But this nation, or this generation, have been somewhat condemned. They've been condemned. And so if we look at the verse from referring to this situation they were in, it says, in this desert meted out after they cried and gave up hope last week when the spies gave their negative report about the land. Your entire number, all those from the age of 20 and up, you were counted. Because you complain against me, you're going to die. You're all going to die in this desert. And if you notice, the next response is Vayis ablu ha'am ma'od. The people mourned greatly. The people are in mourning for the fact that they are going to die. And actually, there's an interesting medrash which talks about how every night they would lie themselves down in graves because they wouldn't know who would wake up in the morning. They were dying out in their droves across these 40 years, as they simply waited and waited until everyone of that generation was finished, and then the new generation was going to be brought in. Then Simon's point comes into play, that actually, even at this point when the new generation is going to come in, they're quite happy in the desert. They've had all their spiritual needs taken care of. But the generation of Korach, they know that this entire mission is going to go. So if we now color our experience or understanding of Korach, we color it by considering his sadness, his mourning, his loss and grief. Let's now get involved in the actual argument that he makes. we already noticed before that he made a very powerful argument to Moshe. He made a powerful argument. He said, well, we are all a holy nation. We're all valuable. We're all the chosen people. Why would you raise yourselves up above us, Moshe? All our lives matter. All of us are the same. And if you consider that in the context of a political system, rather than in the context, say, of a moral system, right? So let's say Black Lives Matter or other ethnic minority lives matter. That is an ethical or moral statement. But if you consider the idea of equality of life in a political context, which is ultimately what their argument was, because their argument was against the features of the day, the power of the day, which is Moshe and Aaron. What is that political system where we're all equal?
But 2 centuries back, we see this argument in a slightly lower level, just with 2 of them. Miriam and are bringing this also to a certain extent as saying like you're elevating yourself higher.
Yep. What with when he's talking about the difference in his prophecy?
Yeah, basically, like they're basically saying that why should he separate himself from his wife? Why are you different to us? So it's almost like 2 centuries back is the start of this. Calling out, basically saying, hold on, aren't we prophets as well? That's what. I'm not saying that but it is relevant to the fact it's only 2 centuries.
That's true. So already we're seeing a certain disconnect that starts to play out between the upper echelons and others. We are seeing that, but then there's a political argument being made by Korach. What's the political argument to say that we're all equal? Why should there be an elite?
Communism. Well, politically, that's communism or Marxism.
That's right. So that's Jeff, Simon, 2 Simons. Yeah, that's right. So there's a certain element of idea of power share. Now that we should all be the same. If that's the case, it's a very strange response that Moshe makes, because we already noticed this when we were going through the text. We notice that Moshe doesn't say, doesn't sort of argue against this idea or dialogue even with this idea of communism. He actually says, is it not enough that you're already an elite? Is it not enough that you already have an exalted position as a Levite in the nation? They're not talking, it doesn't seem like they're talking the same language. And in actual fact, the funny thing is that Korach doesn't respond and say, you didn't hear me. Korach feels like he's been heard by that rebuttal. Because Korach doesn't come back again. Korach says, oh, okay, I suppose you are arguing with me on some level. So let's put it like this. Korach overtly or explicitly argues for equality, and Moshe Rabbeinu, but Moses by response says, aren't you elite enough? Don't you feel like you have enough power as a Levite? What's going on here?
Isn't that because that he really actually does want the power and he's listening to that and not the communist, everyone's equal. He's actually using that as a lever to get himself into a position of power.
Right, so that's exactly, it seems like the case, right? We're all equal, all animals are equal, except pigs who are a little bit more equal or better, right? There's Animal Farm all over again. There's this sort of idea that there's an explicit message which we're all equal. The implicit message is that I have a certain power that I need to hold on to now, that I want to hold on to now. And Moshe dives straight through the explicit message, doesn't dialogue with it at all, and goes to the next level, which is your seeking power. Let's talk about your seeking of power. So small little tangent I want to take over here, which is the difference between explicit beliefs and implicit beliefs. Because I think that is something that is a really powerful and important point to know about and just to think about. So let me share with you some research that has been running from Harvard University for I think it's been running for decades. Let me just, so this is called the implicit attitudes test. Oh, I've timed out. That's pretty annoying. So let me see if I can get back in. Okay, so the implicit attitudes test, we'll just pop us back in very quickly. It is a online survey done by Harvard, which tries to measure implicit attitudes about racism or about prejudice. I'm just going to fill in a few things over here just to make sure that we get there. I want to show you what it looks like. So this is all my demographic details very quickly. Right, I've taken one before. Let's just decline to answer.
Just remember GDPR here, Rabbi.
What does that mean? That I shouldn't share the fact that I'm Jewish with you? Right, okay, here we are. So here we are. This is this is a categorization task. So what you have to do is you get shown words such as human, person, man, or woman, animals, words such as tiger, bear, hippo, rhino. You get shown faces of black people, you get shown faces of white people. And this experiment is built on the idea that it times your responses, it times your response times to categorize different things together. This is based on something called the Stroop task. Very quickly, the Stroop task is where you have a picture which has a word in a particular color and the label in a different color. So for example, orange over here is green and blue is yellow, right? So it takes longer for the brain to process a congruency between when blue is actually colored blue. It takes it longer to it's quicker to process a congruency than an incongruency. I'll just say that again. It's quicker to process a congruent when blue is colored blue, as opposed to when it's incongruent when blue is colored red. So too, that idea about processing speed is applied to the implicit attitudes task, whereby it takes the brain, it's quicker for the brain to process what it understands as congruent than what it understands as incongruent. So if it was congruent, for example, for a white face to be alongside a label of human, then it would be quicker than if the brain already understood that it was incongruent for a black face to be alongside the white label human. Does that make sense? Right, so well, let's just look at an example. Okay, so we're gonna have to label these things, right? So you have to label these things together. I'm not sure what I'm trying to do. We're trying to label, is it white or is it black? So you label it, you start to label these things and you just get used to the task. And then after a while, it tests your reaction times for congruency between these matchings. Okay, so I'm going to get out of this because it's probably not the best demonstration right now, but what this implicit attitudes test shows is that even people who report not to be racist or not to have explicit beliefs about privilege or about superiority, nevertheless, when they have to process something like white with human, they're quicker at that than say black with human. Or they are slower at white with rhino and quicker at black with rhino. Okay, that means that there is a certain implicit attitude, a certain implicit racism that is present, which is picked up upon in reaction times in associations made in this task. They even find that even black people are implicitly racist about black people if they've been sufficiently placed within a white society. Why is this important? It's because we already see this idea of explicit and implicit messages right here in the conversation between Moshe and Korach. We see this sort of dual level of communication, and it's something that often has to be thought about when it comes to something like managing prejudice or managing privilege, managing difference in society, because there's one thing to do to try and make societal change in the explicit realm, in the realm of what we say. It's a very different thing to make a change in the realm of implicit beliefs and implicit ways of approaching things, because that's much more difficult to change. It's like the experiment that was done a little while ago where employers were sent resumes, CVs, which were of exactly the same quality. It's just that one had a typically white name like Richard and one had a typically ethnic minority name like Shahid. And by and large, the Richards got the interviews and the Shahids didn't, even though the actual content of the CV was exactly the same. So we have equal opportunities in terms of government policy, but we haven't yet managed to work on implicit attitudes because that's a much harder thing to budge. So when Moshe talks to Korach, he has the ability to see through the explicit message, which is one of communism, but pierce through the implicit message of something which is much more kind of about a grasp for power, about a grasp for my own need to be great, to hold on to some power. But we can take it further as well. We can take it further as well, because we also notice when we're going through the text, the moment where Moshe tries to dialogue with Datan and Aviram. He calls them up. He says, let's talk. If you want to know, by the way, how to change implicit beliefs about anything like racism, probably one of the best ways to start about privilege is one of the best places to start is to talk, to dialogue, to have conversations with people that you might never have a conversation with. I remember, like, when I was growing up, so living in sort of that Northwest London-ish bubble. I'm not sure if you can call Boreham Wood Northwest London, but probably the only person who was black who I ever had a conversation with was Millie, our cleaner, who'd been with my mum's family since she was a girl. And she was amazing, this lovely Jamaican woman who used to come to our house every Sunday. That was probably the sum total of my communication with people outside of my bubble or of a different skin color. Then I went to the City of London and I thought, oh my gosh, now I'm meeting all these other people, all people of color, Chinese people, black people, people from different parts of the world. And I thought that then that was already like a very diverse, ethnically diverse place. I mean, but when you realize that it's actually an kind of only one sort of socioeconomic group that all go to that place, and sort of a selected out meritocracy of wealth and intelligence. So because it's both it's both paid for and they have an exam to get in. So then you realize actually it's not that diverse at all. And then you go into something like clinical psychology and you start talking to a whole range of different people from all different socioeconomic statuses, from all different backgrounds, and you realize like how little you know about other beliefs, other ways of being, to the extent that almost you don't even know what to say. So I remember I was once working with an Albanian asylum seeker who had fled from Albania to England because of a blood feud that was happening between one family and another. And I had an interpreter in the room speaking to him in Albanian. And I kind of remember just wondering, how do I even communicate things like well-being? Is that even a concept that we share? So what anchors do we have in terms of the ways that we can communicate? So dialogue where you just start to be curious with each other, that's the way to try and build across implicit and explicit differences. That's the way to build bridges. So Moshe calls out to Datan and Aviram, let's talk. And they entirely reject it. They reject the hand that is held out. Let's talk. They say, we're not coming up. Lo na'aleh. We're not coming up. Na'aleh. Na'aleh. We're not going to go up to you, Moshe. Why not? Because you haven't taken us up. You haven't allowed us to do aliyah. We were all hoping to do aliyah, right? Before Nefesh B'Nefesh came along, before there was Operation Magic Carpet, there was the first aliyah wave. It was meant to be this nation, this slave nation from Egypt. They got onto the wings of eagles, so to speak. It's called God 70747. They were flying out from Egypt. They're on the way through the desert, through past Mount Sinai to receive a very, very special plain dinner. And they're on their way to Israel. But you haven't taken us there. We've fallen short, and now we're grieving, we're mourning. We're not going to go with you. You haven't given us aliyah. You haven't given us the opportunity to go up. Now, if we're talking about grief, many of us will be familiar with a grief model, which has kind of been infamous not infamous, but it's quite famous amongst thinkers who try and conceptualize grief. I can find it over here. I've just lost it, sorry. And that is the Kubler-Ross model of grief stages. So what's the first stage of grief? There's that one, which is quite cute, but I think I prefer this one. The first stage of grief is denial, which is also a river in Egypt, but it is denial. Okay, so we would expect I know, it's a poor joke. Rabbis should never tell jokes. I know. I once told someone that as a rabbi, recently, I was just saying that as a rabbi, I'm really quite poor at jokes. All I do is make weird comments that I quite enjoy and laugh at, but no one else laughs at. But at least I make myself laugh, so that's all right. In any case, denial, thank you, Simon. So denial is the first stage of grief. Have we seen any denial? Have we seen any denial amongst the children of Israel up until this point? So I'll remind you of a story last week, which is after they were condemned to not be going to the land of Israel, a hardy bunch of warriors decided that they were still going to go. They were still going to go. They weren't going to give in to this rejection. So we said over here, this is in last week's Torah portion. Moses related all these words to the children of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. Vayis ablu, avelut, they were in mourning. And so then they said they arose early in the morning and ascended to the mountaintop, saying, we are ready to go to the place of which the Lord spoke, for we have sinned. We're ready to go, right? I know that you said we can't go, but we want to go. Marsha says it's going to fail. It's going to fail, and you don't have Hashem behind you. Nevertheless, they lead a military expedition into the land of Israel, and they will get cut down. They've denied their loss. They're not willing to engage with their loss. That's the first stage of grief. What's the second stage of grief? The second stage of grief on the Kubler-Ross model.
Anger.
That's right, anger. What sort of person says to Marsha, I'm not even going to dialogue with you. How dare you try and even suggest that we will have a conversation? It's someone who is seething with anger. Datan and Aviram are being consumed with anger. They are grieving so greatly. They've gone past the denial stage. And it's at this juncture, right? It's at this point that they're grieving and they've denied, and now they're angry. And it's anger which is burning them up. It's an anger that has almost turned inwards. They're on self-destruct mode. Nothing's rational anymore. Nothing's thought through. They're just angry. There's so much loss. There's so much hurt. They're angry. Just as an aside, if ever a person experiences anger, it's often a secondary emotion. So we talk a lot in psychology about primary emotions and secondary emotions. A primary emotion is the thing that's really there. It's the emotion, the deeper emotion that is being expressed. And then there's a secondary emotion on top of that, which protects us from engaging with the deeper issue. So a lot of times we'll find that we're angry. That's a secondary emotion because it's protective of not activating the sadness underneath, because sadness is much more painful. The grief is much more painful. It's almost like the anger protects us from feeling that loss. Should they really be angry at Moshe? Is it his fault? Is it Aaron's fault? No. It's the perfect storm of this Jewish people that have gone through a really tricky transition. They haven't really made it. 2 weeks ago, we spoke about their hankering after an existence of independence, that sweet taste of meat rather than spitting out milk. They haven't been able to healthily individuate from God. They're still hankering after something, an independence, which is totally them, which is the Egypt that they want to taste once more. Then in last week, we described how the hopefulness was turned into hopelessness. It's not only that they were unable to separate healthily from God and to take those messages with him, they were giving up hope on the message itself. And this week now, after they've given up hope on the message, after they've been condemned because they can't be part of this program anymore, now they're just sad. They are so sad. They're grieving, they're mourning. How many of us are grieving and mourning at the moment? Thousands and thousands of people have lost their lives. Hundreds and thousands more have lost their livelihoods, their incomes, their sense of normality. there's so much loss at the moment in the world, not just loss in the sense of bereavement, but loss in the sense of losing my sense of life, losing my sense of self. What do I do if after 20 years of a successful career, in a few short months, the entire building comes tumbling down? Everything I work for, everything I built. I have an amazing restaurant chain. So many different examples. And there's grief. And grief really creates anger. Just want to share with you one final piece to this puzzle. One final piece to this puzzle, which is, sorry, over here, we go back to that first set of verses from Deuteronomy, which talks about the Amorite practices of mourning. Banim atem la'Hashem Elokeichem, you are children of the Lord your God. Losis go to do. It says, don't cut yourselves in response to pain. Now our sages take this exhortation not to cut ourselves, and they make a drasha. They interpret it in a different way. Here's the Gemara over here from Yevamos, and Rish Lakish interprets it as Losis go to do, don't cut yourselves. It says don't become numerous factions. The word tis go to do is connected to agudot. Don't make yourselves into groups. Somehow, Reish Lakish is seeing within this verse the disintegration of society in a mourning practice. By the way, this has halachic significance of lotus go to don't make yourself into groups. I'll give you an example. On Chol HaMoed, there are different practices whether gentlemen put on tefillin or not. Right, Chol HaMoed is both a weekday and a holiday. It's both. So there's a question. On a Yontiv, I don't put on tefillin. On a weekday, I do put on tefillin. What about a day that is a bit Yontiv and a bit weekday? Do I put on tefillin or not? So some different people have different practices. What would happen if you go into a shul and half the gentlemen are putting on tefillin and half the gentlemen are not putting on tefillin? It would look like you've made your community into different groups. That's a violation of this commandment not to make yourselves into separate groups. Now, that's a relatively benign example, but the idea here somehow is that the commandment not to cut yourself and mourning is being learned out, is being interpreted as not to create separate groups within within society. What's going on? It seems like our sages understand that when anger drives us, when anger and grief drives us, it can also drive us to splinter apart, to break apart the big bonds that we have out of anger, out of pain. Don't do that. That's the Korach story. That's the rebellion story. The rebellion story is saying when anger drives you, when anger, which is based on sadness, drives you, it can fundamentally cause breaking down of your society, breaking down your cohesiveness. That's the rebellion. But it doesn't just have to be on a communal level. How many times have we been at a shiva where people aren't talking to each other? They might have even been talking to each other before the shiva. And then the shiva comes along and you put these people in a room. I think it's actually even like a stop-art play, right? You put these people in a room and they go nuts at each other. All the pain, all the anger comes out. Why now? Why do that? The message from this week's parasha, I think, is that when we are faced with grief, there is a natural response to self-destruct, to become angry, to break things down, because that's a more comfortable place to be than sitting in the grief, sitting in the sadness and accepting it. Our parasha says, don't do that. Yes, there are issues of privilege. And yes, we have to dialogue with that. Yes, there are issues of difference, and we have to understand the role of difference. And we haven't shied away from being able to talk about that. There are explicit beliefs, there are implicit beliefs, and we need to have a conversation about that. But don't fall into the trap of anger. Don't fall into the trap of transforming your grief into something that is no longer constructive, but rather breaks things down into little pieces, breaks apart the cohesiveness that we once had. Now that's tough, but that's what the Pasha teaches us we have to do. Otherwise we just get swallowed up, and it doesn't end now. So I don't have a poem to end with this week. I just have a prayer that despite the pain and suffering and sadness that many of us are feeling, and the tendency for anger to overwhelm and cause real breakdowns of into groups, we should have the courage to accept the pain, to accept the suffering, to hold it together, and in so doing, be able to have the conversations that we need to overcome not just explicit issues of difference, but implicit ones too. To be able to live alongside difference, but for that difference not to create divisions based on power, based on privilege, but rather we should just love each other's differences and hold each other together. Thank you for logging in to Chasing Lullabies this evening and for chasing the lullabies away with me. I would love to hear your thoughts, reflections, and questions on this session.
Thank you, Rabbi. Isn't there also of Korach just wanted to be, you know, maybe he now knows Israel. So I want to be as good a Jew as possible.
Why does being a good Jew mean you have to be in power?
That's true. Okay.
I mean, sometimes I have this question, you know, when you have a band, so you've got the drummer and you've got the bassist and you've got the lead guitar and you've got the vocalist. Who's more important than anyone else? Is there a particular member of the band that is more important? I know the front man's on the front, but is he more important? If he didn't have a drummer, if he didn't have a bassist, are they going to be able to produce the same sort of music? So it's a really interesting one. Can I have different roles but still be valued? Yeah, it's tricky.
I'd argue there's a completely different interpretation of his parsha.
Go on, Simon.
Because Korach's argument is that we're all equal and that everything's okay and we all run in parallel groups. Yeah, the bottom line is he gets eaten up. Brown swallows him up. Because his idea is incorrect. Because the connection to the spiritual world that the Kohanim provide is in itself a hierarchy. And he's refuting the very nature of things. A lot of us will know that all the genetic research that's been done that shows a marker in Kohanim going back all the way to the temples. So Korach is in fact trying to refute the actual nature and the structure of things, and he's shown to be wrong in so many ways. The ground eats him up. So it's not that we're all equal and that we all exist in these parallels. There is a hierarchy and a natural hierarchy in life, and the Kohanim were there to be that conduit between us and the spiritual world that he was denying existed.
I hear you. No, I hear you. I think that this becomes that very interesting question of what differences matter, or how do we dialogue with difference? So
You have to start by accepting it.
Right. So if Simon's saying that there's something called a Cohen. There's something called a Cohen. He is a different genetic being. So it's like me saying I want to be it's like me saying I want to be. I have to be careful with my words because there's a lot of politically incorrectness or correctness around this. But you know, it's like me saying I don't want to have Jewish DNA. I can't change that. I am who I am. My parents are who my parents are. So it's like or I don't want to be a man. I know that again. That's a tricky area. But you know, I can have I can have a different gender identity, but I might not be able to have a different sexual identity. I can't have a different sexual identity. That is my chromosomic makeup. So Simon's right. He's saying that somehow the first stage of dialoguing with difference is to recognize difference. But I think that at the moment it becomes really interesting because we live in a world which is trying not to hold on or recognize difference. Somehow it seems like we're trying to equate across all differences, and that's something I think we have to think about, how we can helpfully be okay with difference without that becoming stigmatizing or privileging in some way or other. Or even it is privileging, how can I still recognize the value of all? So I don't have clear answers on this. I just lots of thoughts about it.
The other thing that was always sort of, well, not always, but from this this evening, has sort of like just been twinkling in the back of my mind, is when it says that they're saying, why do you take so much upon yourself? How do we know that it's a matter of greatness and not just a case of, well, you know, you're taking a lot of responsibility for the children of Israel. Perhaps we should share the responsibility, that it's not so much a power take, but a power share request.
Right.
But that's covered in Yitro.
So
Right.
Dan's alluding to the fact that already in earlier on in the Torah we have this sort of mix of power where Moshe's father-in-law comes along and sees Moshe trying to solve every dispute and be entirely present for everyone, and he sees and Yitro sees that that's not a sustainable.
Exactly. So you've got the judges and you've got the different leaders.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean that it's still not taking, that they're still not taking a lot on themselves. So why does it mean that they are taking the power for themselves and not a case of the responsibility for themselves?
So because I think the language they also use is lama tisnasu, why do you make yourself a prince over the rest of us?
Right.
So it sounds like they're not just saying, come on, I'll help you out, like you've got a heavy caseload, Moshe, that sucks, you know. Let me support you in this. It sounds like it's a bit more that your caseload is being used as your means of power, your means of holding privilege and power over the rest of us, and that's something that we can't abide by at the moment. Give us some of the power. Give us actually all the power. Let us be priests too. Interesting one. I'm going to say.
Can I ask a slightly different question? We see a lot in the Chumash where the children of Israel are moaning and saying, you know, it was great in Egypt. We've seen it multiple times. It was great in Egypt. We had leeks, we had watermelons, we had this, we had that, we had honey. Why didn't they just go? The ones that were moaning, who was holding them back? Like if I want to leave Barnet, not that I'm leaving Barnet. You know, I'm sure people would try and stop me, but
the exodus to Edgware.
Yeah. Who's coming? You coming?
No way.
I'm saying it's like quite interesting that like the response is, you know, my response would be, if you want to go, stop moaning. Go back to Egypt.
I think that's a good point. My first thought is that we all have fantasies about what could be. Sometimes it's more exciting to play with the fantasy than it is actually to live it out.
Right.
Yeah.
My friends, thank you so much for logging in tonight. It's a real pleasure to chase away the lullabies together. See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Bye.
Thank